David wiped the sweat from his forehead as he closed his constitutional law textbook. Another 18-hour study day was coming to an end. The library clock showed midnight, and he was one of only 3 students still hunched over their books in the massive reading room. This wasn't unusual for David. While his classmates went out for drinks or watched movies, he spent every free moment studying, reviewing, and preparing. The 26-year-old had worked too hard to get here to let anything slip now. Growing up in a small apartment in Chicago with his mom, David learned early that success meant working twice as hard as everyone else. His mother, Lisa, cleaned office buildings at night and worked at a grocery store during the day. She never complained, never made excuses. She just worked. And she made sure David understood that education was his ticket to a better life. Now, in his final year at one of the country's top law schools, David maintained a perfect record. Every test, every assignment, every project, all perfect scores. His professors knew him well, not just because of his grades, but because of the thoughtful questions he asked and the unique perspectives he brought to class discussions. While other students quoted famous cases they'd memorized, David understood the deeper meaning behind the laws and could explain complex legal concepts in ways that made perfect sense. But tonight, David wasn't thinking about constitutional law or his upcoming final exams. He was thinking about the phone call he'd received earlier that day. His girlfriend, Jessica, had called with an invitation that both excited and worried him. Jessica was different from anyone David had ever known. She came from the kind of family that had summer houses and Christmas parties that looked like scenes from fancy magazines. Her father worked in finance, her mother organized charity events, and her brother was already a successful lawyer at one of those firms with names that sounded like a list of presidents. They'd met 2 years ago in the university library. Jessica was working on her psychology research when her laptop crashed, and she looked ready to cry. David, who'd always been good with computers, offered to help. 3 hours later, he'd recovered all her work, and she'd insisted on buying him coffee as a thank you. That coffee turned into dinner. Dinner turned into long walks around campus, and before either of them realized it, they were inseparable. Jessica never made David feel different or out of place. When he mentioned he couldn't afford to go to expensive restaurants, she suggested cooking together at his apartment. When he had to work his part-time job at the campus bookstore, she'd sit in the corner reading while he handled customers. She made their different backgrounds feel unimportant, like love was enough to bridge any gap. But now she was asking him to meet her family at their annual summer gathering. The way she described it made it sound like something out of a movie. A big house by the ocean, extended family flying in from different states, fancy dinner parties with family friends who were judges and politicians and business owners. David had met Jessica's parents once before, briefly, when they came to campus for a parents' weekend event. The interaction had been polite but cold. Her father, Robert, had shaken his hand firmly but asked pointed questions about David's family and his plans after law school. Her mother, Caroline, had smiled but seemed to look right through him, as if he wasn't quite there. They'd been perfectly polite, but David left that meeting feeling like he'd somehow disappointed them just by existing. Still, Jessica insisted they were good people who just needed time to get to know him. She talked about how her grandmother would love his stories, about growing up in Chicago, and how her father would be impressed by his academic achievements. She made it sound so simple, so possible. The invitation came with complications, though. The gathering was the same weekend as David's study group for the most important final exam of his law school career. Missing it would mean studying alone, which was harder and less effective. Plus, he'd have to ask for time off from both his part-time jobs, the bookstore and his evening tutoring gig. That meant losing nearly $200 in income, money he really couldn't afford to lose. But Jessica had sounded so hopeful on the phone. She'd been patient for 2 years, never pushing him to meet her extended family, never complaining. When he had to study instead of attending her family events, she deserved this. Their relationship deserved this chance. So David had said yes, trying to match her enthusiasm, even as his stomach twisted with anxiety. Now, sitting in the quiet library, He wondered what he'd gotten himself into. He'd grown up in a world where success meant having enough money for rent and groceries. Jessica's world seemed to be about the right clothes, the right schools, the right connections. David had worked his way through college waiting tables and stocking shelves. Jessica had spent her summers in Europe and at family houses he'd only seen in the background of her photos. The more he thought about it, the more worried he became. What would they talk about? Jessica's family probably spent their summers sailing and playing golf. David's idea of a perfect summer day was finding a quiet park where he could read without interruption. They probably had opinions about politics and business that came from personal experience with powerful people. David's political views came from seeing how policies affected real people in his neighborhood. But then he thought about Jessica, how she laughed at his jokes, how she listened to his ideas about changing the legal system to help ordinary people, how she never once made him feel ashamed of his background or his dreams. If she believed her family could accept him, maybe he was worrying for nothing. David packed his books and headed back to his small apartment. Tomorrow, he'd need to figure out what to wear to a fancy family gathering. His wardrobe consisted mainly of clothes from discount stores. Practical, clean, but nothing that would fit in at the kind of event Jessica had described. He'd have to be creative. As he walked through the empty campus streets, David reminded himself of everything he'd accomplished. He'd earned his spot at this prestigious law school through merit, not connections. His professors respected his work. His grades spoke for themselves. He belonged in academic circles, even if he'd never belonged in social ones. The weekend would be a test. But David had been taking tests his whole life. Some had been written on paper. Others had been about surviving difficult circumstances or proving himself in rooms where he was the only person who looked like him or came from where he came from. He'd passed all of those tests by being himself, working hard, staying respectful, and never backing down from a challenge. Still, as he unlocked his apartment door and looked around his small, neat space, David couldn't shake the feeling that this weekend would be different. This wouldn't be about academic performance or professional skills. This would be about whether Jessica's family could see past their assumptions and recognize the person Jessica had fallen in love with. He pulled out his phone and looked at a text from Jessica. "Can't wait for you to meet everyone properly. They're going to love you as much as I do." David smiled despite his nerves. Jessica's confidence in him had always been unwavering, even when his own confidence faltered. Maybe that would be enough. Maybe love really could bridge the gap between their worlds. As he prepared for bed, David made a decision. He'd go to this gathering not as someone trying to prove he belonged, but as someone who already knew his own worth. He'd be respectful, genuine, and true to himself. If Jessica's family couldn't accept that, it would say more about them than about him. He had no idea that this weekend would test not just his ability to fit into their world, but their ability to recognize excellence when they saw it. David had spent years proving himself in classrooms and libraries. Soon he'd have to prove himself in living rooms and dining rooms where the rules were different, but where his character would matter just as much. The next morning, David would begin preparing for what would become the most challenging and revealing weekend of his life. But tonight, he simply focused on the fact that the woman he loved wanted him to meet her family, and that had to count for something. The ocean house was even more impressive than David had imagined. 3 stories of white wood and large windows overlooked a private beach, where sailboats bobbed in the distance. The circular driveway was filled with expensive cars, each one probably worth more than David had earned in his entire life. As Jessica parked her car, David took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was here. The first day had gone better than expected. Jessica's grandmother, Helen, was a retired college professor who seemed genuinely interested in David's studies. She asked thoughtful questions about his research and shared stories from her own academic career. A few cousins around David's age had been friendly enough, though their conversations revealed how different their experiences were. While they talked about internships at their parents' companies, David shared stories about his work at the bookstore. But by the second day, the polite mask was starting to slip. It started during breakfast. David was sitting at the large kitchen table, enjoying coffee and trying to make conversation with Jessica's uncle Peter, who worked in real estate. Jessica had stepped outside to take a phone call, leaving David alone with several family members. "So, David," Peter said, buttering his toast with deliberate slowness. "Jessica tells us you're finishing law school soon. That's quite an achievement." The way he said achievement made it sound like something surprising, as if David had accomplished something no one expected him to manage. "Yes, sir. I graduate in a few months," David replied, keeping his tone respectful. "And where are you thinking of working?" Peter's wife, Linda, asked. "I imagine there are some good opportunities in community legal services, public defender, work." David noticed how she paused before suggesting those fields, as if those were the only places someone like him could realistically work. "Actually, I'm considering several options. Corporate law, constitutional work, maybe academia eventually." Peter and Linda exchanged a quick glance. "Corporate law," Peter repeated slowly. "Well, that's ambitious. Those firms can be very particular about who they hire. It's often about connections, family backgrounds, you know. The clients expect a certain type of representation." Before David could respond, Jessica's brother Michael walked into the kitchen. Michael was 32 and worked at one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. He'd gone to the same law school as David, but 15 years earlier when his father's connections had guaranteed his admission. "What are we talking about?" Michael asked, pouring himself coffee. "David's career plans," Linda said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "He's thinking about corporate law." Michael laughed, not unkindly, but in a way that made David's stomach tighten. "Corporate law? That's a tough field, man. Really competitive. Most of the guys I work with, we all knew each other from prep school, or our dads played golf together. It's kind of a closed circle, you know?" "I understand it's competitive," David said quietly, "but I think my academic record speaks for itself." "Oh, grades are important," Michael agreed, "but they're not everything. These big firms want people who can relate to their clients, CEOs, board members, old money families. It's about culture, fit as much as legal skills." The conversation was interrupted when Jessica returned, but the damage was done. David could see the doubt in their eyes, the assumption that he was reaching too high, dreaming too big for someone from his background. Later, that afternoon, the extended family gathered for drinks on the back porch. David found himself standing awkwardly as conversations flowed around him. People talked about mutual friends he'd never heard of, vacation destinations he'd never seen, and business deals that involved more money than his mother had earned in her lifetime. Robert, Jessica's father, approached with two other men David had been introduced to earlier, a judge named William and a businessman called Thomas. All three held glasses of expensive whiskey and wore the confident expressions of men who'd never doubted their place in the world. "David," Robert said, his tone friendly, but somehow patronizing. "We were just discussing the state of legal education these days. William here thinks standards have really declined in recent years." William nodded seriously. "It's true. These schools are under so much pressure to diversify that they're accepting students who wouldn't have qualified in the past. Not their fault, really, but it's changed the whole academic environment." David felt his jaw tighten but kept his expression neutral. "I think diversity in education strengthens the profession," he said carefully. "Different perspectives make for better lawyers." Thomas laughed. "That's a nice way to look at it. But let's be honest. When I need legal representation, I want the best qualified person, not someone who got in because of quotas or special programs." "I'm sure you worked very hard," William added, his tone suggesting he was being generous. "But there's a difference between academic success and real-world success. Law school is one thing. Actually practicing law, especially at the highest levels, requires a different set of skills." Robert nodded. "Experience in the right social circles, understanding how business really works, knowing how to talk to judges and clients who come from certain backgrounds. These things matter more than most people realize." David realized they were essentially telling him that his academic achievements meant nothing, that he'd never truly succeed in their world no matter how hard he worked or how much he accomplished. The worst part was how they said it, not with anger or obvious hostility, but with the casual dismissal of people who'd never had to prove themselves. "I appreciate the advice," David said, his voice steady despite the anger building inside him. The evening got worse during dinner. Jessica had planned a special meal to introduce David to more family friends, including several couples who worked in law and business. The dining room was elegant, with candles and flowers that probably cost more than David's monthly grocery budget. Conversation flowed easily among the guests, who all seemed to know each other from years of social gatherings. David tried to participate, but every topic seemed to require knowledge he didn't have or experiences he'd never shared. When someone mentioned a recent legal case involving a company David had studied extensively, he tried to join the discussion. He offered a thoughtful analysis of the constitutional issues involved, drawing from research he'd done for one of his law review articles. The table went quiet for a moment. Then Michael jumped in. "That's an interesting perspective," he said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but interesting. Of course, the real issue wasn't constitutional law. It was about managing client relationships and understanding business priorities. That's something you learn in practice, not in textbooks. Several people nodded in agreement. Someone changed the subject to a golf tournament, and David was effectively excluded from the conversation again. But the most painful moment came later, when David overheard a conversation he wasn't meant to hear. He'd stepped outside for fresh air and was standing near an open window when he heard Jessica's mother, Caroline, talking to two other women. "I just don't understand what Jessica sees in him," Caroline was saying, her voice carrying clearly through the night air. "He seems nice enough, but they have nothing in common. She's always been such a bright girl, so accomplished. I thought she'd end up with someone more suitable." "Maybe it's just a phase," one of her friends suggested. "Young people sometimes go through these periods where they want to rebel or experiment." "I hope so," Caroline replied. "Robert's been very patient, but we're concerned about Jessica's future. This young man seems determined to pursue corporate law of all things. It's almost embarrassing how unrealistic he is about his prospects." "Well, at least Jessica will figure it out eventually," the third woman said. "Once she starts meeting more appropriate young men in her graduate program, she'll realize what she's missing." David stood frozen by the window, feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. These people had written him off completely. They saw his ambitions as jokes, his relationship with Jessica as a temporary mistake, his very presence as something to be tolerated until Jessica came to her senses. When he returned to the house, Jessica immediately noticed his changed mood. "What's wrong?" she asked, pulling him aside. David wanted to tell her everything, about the condescending advice from her father and his friends, about Michael's dismissive comments, about the conversation he'd overheard. But looking at Jessica's concerned face, he realized how impossible his situation was. If he complained about her family's treatment, he'd sound bitter and jealous. If he stayed quiet, he'd have to endure another day of their polite contempt. "Just tired," he said finally. "It's been a long day." Jessica studied his face, clearly not believing him but not sure how to push. "They just need time to get to know you," she said softly. "My family can be a little traditional in their thinking, but once they see how amazing you are, they'll come around." David nodded and forced a smile, but privately he wondered if Jessica really understood what was happening. Her family wasn't just being traditional. They were systematically undermining his confidence and dismissing his achievements. They'd decided he didn't belong in their world, and they were making sure he knew it. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, David helped clean up, trying to stay busy and avoid more painful conversations. But he couldn't stop thinking about what Caroline had said. Was he really being unrealistic about his future? Had law school given him false confidence about what was possible? These doubts felt foreign and uncomfortable. David had spent his entire life pushing past other people's low expectations. But something about this weekend was different. These people had power, connections, and experience in the exact world David hoped to enter. When they said he didn't belong, it carried more weight than the doubts of his childhood neighbors or his high school teachers. Tomorrow would bring the final day of the gathering, and David wasn't sure how much more he could take. He'd come here hoping to win over Jessica's family, Instead, he was starting to question everything he'd worked for and believed about himself. What David didn't know was that tomorrow would bring revelations that would change everything. Not just for him, but for every person who had spent the weekend underestimating him. David woke up on the final morning feeling emotionally drained. He'd barely slept, replaying the events of the previous day over and over in his mind. The dismissive comments, the condescending advice, the overheard conversation. It all swirled together into a painful reminder that some barriers seemed impossible to cross, no matter how hard you worked. Jessica was already up, getting ready for the final family brunch. She moved around the room quietly, sensing David's mood but not sure how to address it. The easy conversation they usually shared felt strained, weighed down by unspoken tensions. "Grandmother Helen wants to talk with you this morning," Jessica said as she brushed her hair. "She mentioned it last night after you went upstairs." David nodded without much enthusiasm. Helen had been the one bright spot in an otherwise difficult weekend. At least with her, he felt like a person rather than a problem to be solved. He found Helen in the sunroom, sipping coffee and reading a newspaper. At 85, she still had the sharp eyes and quick mind of someone who'd spent decades in academia. She looked up when David entered and gestured for him to sit across from her. "You look troubled, young man," she said directly. "This weekend hasn't been what you hoped, has it?" David considered giving a polite, diplomatic answer, but something about Helen's honest gaze made him want to be truthful. "It's been challenging," he admitted. Helen nodded knowingly. "My family can be very narrow in their thinking. They mistake privilege for wisdom and assume their limited experience represents the whole world." She paused, studying David's face. "But I suspect there's more to your story than they realize." "What do you mean?" Helen smiled mysteriously. "I may be old, but I still have friends in academic circles. Yesterday I made a few phone calls to colleagues at your law school." David's stomach tightened. Had Helen been checking up on him? Trying to verify his claims about his academic performance? "I hope you don't mind," Helen continued, "but I was curious about the young man who'd captured my granddaughter's heart. Imagine my surprise when I learned that you're not just another law student." She leaned forward, her eyes bright with something that looked like pride. "David, why didn't you tell anyone that you're the top student in your entire class? That you're graduating as valedictorian?" David felt his cheeks warm. It didn't seem important. People don't usually ask about class rankings." "Not important?" Helen laughed. "My dear boy, do you realize what an extraordinary achievement that is? At one of the most competitive law schools in the country, no less." She wasn't finished. "And what about your position on the law review? My friend Professor Martinez tells me you're not just a member, you're the editor-in-chief. She says your recent article on constitutional interpretation has been making waves in legal circles." David shifted uncomfortably. "I just wrote about something that interested me." "Something that interested you," Helen repeated with amusement. "David, federal judges are citing your work. Supreme Court clerks are discussing your research. You've accomplished more in law school than most lawyers accomplish in their entire careers." The conversation was interrupted when Robert appeared in the doorway. "Mother, there you are. We're getting ready for brunch." He noticed David and nodded politely. "David." Helen stood up with a determined expression. "Perfect timing, Robert. I was just learning about David's achievements. Did you know he's graduating?" "As valedictorian?" Robert's polite smile faltered slightly. "Valedictorian? That's wonderful. And he's editor-in-chief of the Law Review," Helen continued, clearly enjoying her son's discomfort. "Plus, he's already been offered a position clerking for a Supreme Court justice next year." The color drained from Robert's face. Supreme Court. Clerkships were among the most prestigious positions in the legal world, reserved for the absolute best law students in the country. These positions typically led to partnerships at elite firms or prestigious academic careers. We had no idea," Robert stammered. "Of course you didn't," Helen said sharply. "You were too busy making assumptions to ask the right questions." Word of this conversation spread quickly through the house. By the time the family gathered for brunch, Everyone had heard some version of the story. The atmosphere in the dining room was thick with tension and embarrassment. Michael, who had been so dismissive of David's career prospects the night before, could barely make eye contact. His own position at his prestigious law firm suddenly seemed less impressive compared to someone who would be working directly with Supreme Court justices. Caroline tried to act as if nothing had changed, but her forced cheerfulness was painful to watch. She made several attempts to engage David in conversation about his achievements, suddenly very interested in his academic work. Peter and Linda, who had suggested David should focus on public defender work, now seemed fascinated by his plans for constitutional law. Their questions came rapidly as if they were trying to make up for 2 days of dismissive comments, but it was William, the judge, who seemed most shaken by the revelation. As someone who worked in the federal court system, he understood exactly what David's accomplishments meant. Supreme Court clerks often became the most influential lawyers of their generation. Some became judges themselves, others became law professors, and still others joined the most elite law firms in the country. "David," William said carefully, "I owe you an apology. Yesterday I made some comments about academic standards that were inappropriate." David looked around the table, at faces that had been condescending or dismissive for the past 2 days. Now they showed a mixture of embarrassment, surprise, and what looked like fear, as if they were realizing they'd badly misjudged someone who might become very powerful in the legal world. "I appreciate that," David said quietly. But Michael, perhaps driven by embarrassment or unable to accept how wrong he'd been, made a crucial mistake. "Look, this is all very impressive," he said, his voice carrying a defensive edge. "But let's be honest here. These days law schools have quotas to meet, diversity requirements. It's not always about who's actually the most qualified." The room fell completely silent. Jessica's face went pale, Helen looked furious. Even Robert seemed shocked by his son's words. Something inside David finally snapped. For 2 days, he'd endured subtle insults and condescending advice. He'd listened to people question his abilities, dismiss his achievements, and treat his dreams as unrealistic fantasies. But this direct attack on his character and accomplishments was too much. David stood up slowly, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that made everyone at the table pay attention. "Michael," he said, "I need to clarify something for you. I didn't get into law school because of quotas or special programs. I got in because I scored in the top 1% on the LSAT and graduated summa cum laude from college." He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "I'm not valedictorian because of diversity requirements. I'm valedictorian because I've earned the highest grades in every single class for 3 years straight. I'm editor-in-chief of the Law Review because the other students elected me based on my legal writing and leadership abilities." David's voice grew stronger as he spoke. "And I wasn't offered a Supreme Court clerkship because I checked some demographic box. Justice Thompson chose me after reviewing applications from the top students at every law school in the country. She chose me because of my research on constitutional law, which has already been cited in 12 federal court decisions." The room was dead quiet. Michael's face had gone red, but he seemed unable to speak. "You want to know about qualifications?" David continued. "I've published 4 law review articles that are being used in constitutional law classes across the country. I speak 3 languages fluently, which is why international law firms have been trying to recruit me. And next month, I'm delivering the keynote address at a conference where federal judges and Supreme Court justices will be in the audience." David looked directly at Michael. "Your own law firm has been trying to recruit me for 6 months. The managing partner has called me personally 3 times. They've offered me a starting salary that's 40% higher than what they typically pay new associates." This last revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. His own firm had been pursuing someone he'd spent the weekend mocking. "But here's what you really need to understand," David said, his voice now carrying a quiet intensity that commanded the room's complete attention. "Everything I've accomplished, I've earned through merit alone. I've never asked for special treatment or made excuses for my background. I've simply outworked and outperformed everyone around me." He looked around the table, making eye contact with each person who had dismissed him. So when you suggest that my achievements are somehow less valid because of who I am or where I come from, you're not just insulting me. You're revealing something very ugly about yourselves. David sat back down, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his body. The silence that followed was deafening. Helen was the first to speak, her voice filled with admiration. "Well said, young man." "Very well said indeed." Jessica reached over and took David's hand, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and love. She'd never seen this side of him. Not angry or defensive, but powerful and unshakable in his knowledge of his own worth. Robert cleared his throat awkwardly. "David, we owe you a significant apology. We've been terribly unfair." But the damage was done. David had shown them who he really was, and in doing so, he'd revealed who they really were too. The weekend had become a mirror, reflecting not just David's excellence, but the family's prejudices and assumptions. The final brunch continued in uncomfortable silence, punctuated by awkward attempts at conversation. Everyone now understood that they'd spent 2 days condescending to someone who would likely become one of the most successful lawyers of his generation. More importantly, they realized that David had endured their treatment with grace and dignity, never once bragging about his accomplishments or trying to make them feel small. His character had been tested and he'd passed with flying colors. As the meal ended and guests began to leave, the family was left to confront an uncomfortable truth. They'd failed a test they didn't even know they were taking. The car ride back to campus was quiet for the first hour. Jessica drove while David stared out the window, watching the expensive houses of the coastal town give way to ordinary neighborhoods and highway rest stops. The weekend felt like a strange dream, or maybe a nightmare that had somehow turned into something else entirely. "You were incredible back there," Jessica finally said, breaking the silence. "I've never seen you like that before." David turned to look at her. "I'm sorry if I embarrassed you. I know they're your family." "Embarrassed me?" Jessica pulled over at the next rest stop and turned to face him fully. "David, I was proud of you. I was also ashamed of them, but proud of you." She reached for his hand. "I had no idea you'd been holding back so much. Why didn't you ever tell me about all those achievements? The Supreme Court clerkship? The articles you've published, everything?" David was quiet for a moment. "I guess I never wanted you to think I was bragging. And honestly, I never thought it mattered that much. I just did the work because I loved it." "It matters," Jessica said firmly. "Not because it makes you more worthy of respect, you already deserve that, but because it shows the world who you really are." Back at the beach house, the family was having their own difficult conversations. Helen sat in the living room with Robert and Caroline, while Michael paced by the windows overlooking the ocean. 30 years as a judge," William was saying to anyone who would listen, "and I've never been so wrong about someone. That young man is going to be arguing cases in front of the Supreme Court before he's 35. Robert rubbed his forehead. "Mother, how did you know? How did you figure out who he really was when we completely missed it?" Helen looked at her son with disappointment. "I listened to him, Robert. I paid attention to how he spoke, what he was curious about, how he treated people. You all were so busy looking at where he came from that you never bothered to see where he was going." Caroline was sitting quietly in the corner, looking mortified. "The things I said," she whispered. "That conversation by the window, do you think he heard me?" "I hope he did," Helen said sharply. "Maybe it helped him understand exactly what kind of people he was dealing with." Michael stopped pacing and turned to face the room. "Look, I made a mistake, okay? I said some things I shouldn't have said. But you have to understand, this is a shock. Jessica never told us any of this." "She shouldn't have had to," Helen replied. "You should have gotten to know him before you judged him." The real reckoning came on Monday morning. Michael arrived at his law firm to find 3 messages waiting for him, all marked urgent. The first was from his managing partner, Richard Sterling, asking him to come to his office immediately. Michael found Sterling behind his massive desk, looking serious. "Michael, I understand you spent the weekend with David Chen." Michael's stomach dropped. "Yes, sir, he's dating my sister." "And how did that go?" Michael realized he was in dangerous territory. It was educational. Sterling leaned back in his chair. Michael, we've been trying to recruit David Chen for 8 months. He's turned down offers from every major firm in the city because he's committed to his Supreme Court clerkship. Do you have any idea how rare that kind of integrity is? I'm beginning to understand, sir. This young man is going to be one of the most important constitutional lawyers of his generation. The articles he's written are already changing how courts interpret certain legal principles. We've offered him a partnership track that we've never offered to anyone straight out of law school. Sterling stood up and walked to the window. So imagine my surprise when I hear that someone in our firm spent the weekend questioning his qualifications and suggesting his achievements were due to special treatment. Michael felt his career flashing before his eyes. Sir, I can explain. You don't need to explain anything to me, Sterling interrupted. You need to figure out how to repair the damage you've done. David Chen could be a valuable connection for this firm, or he could be someone who remembers exactly how he was treated by our associates. Meanwhile, David was back in his small apartment, trying to process everything that had happened. His phone had been ringing all morning with calls from law firms, academic programs, and even a few journalists who had somehow heard about his upcoming Supreme Court clerkship. But the call that mattered most came from Jessica. My grandmother wants to apologize, she said. Actually, my whole family wants to apologize, but Grandmother Helen especially wants to talk to you. Jessica, they don't need to apologize. I understand why they reacted the way they did. No, you don't understand, Jessica said firmly. This isn't about politeness or social obligations. They genuinely realized they were wrong, and they want to make it right. That evening, Helen called David directly. Her voice was warm but serious. David, I want you to know that what happened this weekend has been a wake-up call for our entire family. We pride ourselves on being good people, but we failed a basic test of character. Mrs. Wellington, I appreciate that, but please let me finish, Helen interrupted gently. I've been thinking about this all day. You showed remarkable grace under pressure. You endured condescension and dismissal with dignity. And when you finally defended yourself, you did it with facts and integrity, not anger or cruelty. She paused. That tells me more about your character than any resume ever could. Over the following weeks, the changes in Jessica's family were remarkable. Robert, embarrassed by his behavior, began making donations to scholarship programs for first-generation college students. He also started mentoring young professionals from diverse backgrounds through his business connections. Caroline joined the board of a nonprofit that provided support for students from low-income families attending prestigious universities. She later told friends that meeting David had made her realize how many assumptions she'd been making about people based on their backgrounds. But the most dramatic change was in Michael. The conversation with his managing partner had been a career-defining moment. He realized that his prejudices hadn't just made him a worse person, they'd made him a worse lawyer and a liability to his firm. Michael began volunteering with a legal aid organization, working with lawyers from all backgrounds on cases involving civil rights and social justice. The experience opened his eyes to perspectives he'd never considered and made him a more effective advocate for all his clients. 3 months later, David graduated as valedictorian in a ceremony attended by hundreds of legal professionals, academics, and family members. His commencement speech, titled Excellence Without Apology, was later published in several legal journals. In the speech, David talked about the importance of merit-based achievement while acknowledging the barriers that many people face. He spoke about the danger of assumptions and the power of giving people a chance to show who they really are. Success, he said to the graduating class, isn't just about what you accomplish. It's about how you treat others on your way to accomplishing it, and how you respond when others don't immediately see your worth. Jessica's family attended the graduation ceremony. Helen sat in the front row, beaming with pride. Robert and Caroline watched with newfound respect and admiration. Even Michael was there, genuinely happy to celebrate David's achievement. After the ceremony, William approached David with a heartfelt apology. I've been a federal judge for 3 decades, he said, and I thought I understood merit and qualification. You taught me that I still had a lot to learn. David's Supreme Court clerkship began that fall. Justice Thompson, who had chosen him from hundreds of qualified candidates, quickly recognized that she'd made an exceptional choice. David's research was thorough, his writing was brilliant, and his insights often helped shape the court's decisions on complex constitutional issues. During his clerkship year, David was offered positions at the most prestigious law firms in the country. He was also invited to join the faculties of several top law schools. Legal scholars began citing his work regularly, and his opinion pieces in major newspapers helped shape public discourse on constitutional law. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The same law review that had published David's student articles offered him a position as a contributing editor, a role typically reserved for established legal scholars with decades of experience. A year after the disastrous family weekend, David and Jessica got engaged. The proposal happened at the same beach house where David had faced such hostility, but this time the atmosphere was completely different. Helen hosted an engagement party where she proudly introduced David to family friends as one of the brightest legal minds of his generation. The same people who had dismissed him a year earlier now sought his opinions on legal and political issues. Robert pulled David aside during the party. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that weekend was one of the most important learning experiences of my life. You handled yourself with more class than I did, and I'm grateful you gave us a chance to prove we could be better." David's mother, Lisa, flew in from Chicago for the engagement party. Watching her son surrounded by love and respect, celebrating his achievements and his future, she felt a pride that was almost overwhelming. "I always knew you were special," she told David as they walked along the beach, "but I never imagined this. You've exceeded every dream I had for you." "I had good examples," David replied, putting his arm around his mother. "You taught me that hard work and dignity matter more than what other people think." As the evening wound down, David stood on the same porch where he'd overheard Caroline's dismissive comments about their relationship being a phase. Now, a year later, he was officially becoming part of the family. Jessica found him there looking out at the ocean. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. "Just how much can change when people are willing to look past their assumptions," David said. "Your family isn't the same group of people I met last year." "Neither are you," Jessica pointed out. "You're more confident now, more willing to let people see who you really are." David smiled. "I guess we all learned something." The weekend that had started as a test of whether David could fit into Jessica's world had become something much more important. It had been a test of character for everyone involved, and in the end it had brought out the best in people who had initially shown their worst. David's story became a reminder that excellence speaks for itself, but sometimes it needs to speak loudly enough to be heard over the noise of prejudice and assumption. And when it does, it has the power to change not just perceptions, but hearts and minds as well.